Unseen Podcast, a podcast dedicated to missing people, unresolved cases, and UK true crime. Today we are going to be exploring the story of Stanley Setty in 1949. This strange case has many confusing twists and turns, and the investigation led police to a brutal story and an extremely violent man. This episode contains descriptions that some listeners may find distressing, so listener discretion is advised. On Saturday the 23rd of October 1949, Stanley Tiffin had decided to go shooting on the Dengie Flats area of East Essex in the southeast. This area is made up of mud flats and salt marshes. It's known today as a site of special scientific interest and an area of conservation. During the Second World War, the area had been used as a bombing range by the RAF and was also the site of crash landings by planes failing to make it to the nearby airfield. In 1949, this is what the flats would have been known for, given that the war had only ended 4 years prior. Stanley travelled out to the flats that day, however after he had arrived, something unusual caught his attention. The tide was very high that day and he could see something floating on top of the water. It was floating about 100 feet from the sea wall, and to begin with, Stanley didn't think too much about it, believing it had probably been dropped by an aircraft. He would, however, see the package again as it became washed up on the flats. He decided to wade out to retrieve it, and it initially looked just like a blanket. However, when Stanley looked closer, he could see that it was sewn together at the edges. It was clear that there was something inside. Stanley decided to open it to check and was horrified by the sight. Inside was the torso and arms of a human. The body had been dismembered and had no head or legs. Stanley Tiffin secured it so that it didn't float away and quickly went to get police. Investigators led by Superintendent Colin McDougall attended the scene to analyse the unusual and gruesome discovery. McDougall was aided by Superintendent Sutherland from Scotland Yard and Superintendent Totterdell, Chief of Essex CID. Due to the location of the body, investigators travelled along the flats and had to wade out wearing rubber boots to the location. The body was removed and the area was then searched in an effort to find the head and legs of the victim. Police scoured the area for anything that could be connected to the body. The torso was removed from the marshes and the investigators set out to try and identify the person. It was clear that they were dealing with a male body and that he had been dismembered to try and disguise his identity. It became apparent when examining the body, however, that they had recovered the torso but also the arms and hands. This was a breakthrough as it meant that the police could use fingerprints to find out who he was. After the remains had been examined by Home Office pathologist Francis Camps, fingerprints were taken from the hands. The investigators were already working under a theory that they knew who the man may be. The fingerprints went on to confirm their theory. The body was that of Stanley Setty, a man that had gone missing on October the 4th. 46-year-old Stanley Setty worked as a used car dealer and lived with his sister and brother-in-law in Paddington, London. He was originally from Baghdad, but now lived in the UK. On the 4th of October he left his home and stated that he was going out to buy a car in Watford. It was known that he had left with a large amount of cash on him, around £1,500. Despite leaving in his car, the car was found in its usual parking spot, but Stanley was nowhere to be found. The investigation into Stanley's disappearance had already been quite thorough, with detectives from Scotland Yard becoming involved quite early on. The fact that he had such a large quantity of money led the police to believe this could have caused someone to harm him for the money. It was discovered that Stanley had last been seen buying a newspaper on the 4th around 6:40 p.m, but then his movements were largely unknown. Police decided to trace the banknotes that Stanley had in his possession, as he had recently got them from the bank. The £5 notes were between the numbers M41039801 and 040000, and these numbers were published in the newspapers, in case anyone may have come across them. Stanley had possibly been spotted in other places, and these tips about sightings of Stanley's car were looked into closely. One of these tips stated that his car had been seen driving out of London in a westerly direction. Over the next 2 weeks, the police continued to search for Stanley. A firm of solicitors even issued a reward of £1,000 for any information about Stanley's whereabouts. This, however, did not lead to any new tips coming in. Information did come in to suggest that Stanley may be in Malta. A woman claimed to have seen him, however when police looked into this lead, they found that it wasn't Stanley and that he had not made it that far. It seemed like he had just vanished, and while his sister and brother-in-law continued to search for him, there was nothing that could explain where he had gone. The news that his remains had been found at the Dengie Flats were devastating for Stanley's family, particularly when the details of how his remains had been left was divulged to them. The question now was, who could have done this to him? Less than a week after the discovery, it appeared that there was movement in the case as a man was detained for questioning. The Derby Daily Telegraph on the 28th of October reported that a man was being questioned in connection with Stanley's murder. The article stated that he was in protective custody, and he may prove to be a key witness in the case. Other people were also interviewed in relation to the murder. Not much was known about this key witness except that he was in his 30s and was believed to be well dressed. The next day it was reported that even more progress had been made. The police had an arrest. Newspapers across the country reported that a 29-year-old man called Brian Donald Hume had been arrested. Hume had been questioned at his home 2 days prior, and the police had reportedly gained enough information from their inquiries to charge him with the murder. Officers travelled to his house to search it for anything that may relate to Stanley or the murder. Hume was presented at a hearing that lasted 3 minutes to hear the charges against him. He was told by the magistrate that he was remanded in custody for the murder of Stanley Setty, to which Hume replied, OK. It's reported in the Yorkshire Evening Post on the 29th of October that Detective Superintendent Colin McDougall from Scotland Yard told the court, "At 6:10 p.m. yesterday I saw the prisoner at Albany Street Police Station. I said as a result of inquiries made I'm going to charge you with murdering Stanley Setty between October the 4th and 5th, 1949. I cautioned him and he said, 'No, I didn't kill him, I'm not guilty.'" Hume was remanded until the following week. It's reported that around 200 people had gathered outside the courthouse to watch him leave. The public, including Stanley's sister and brother-in-law, were pleased that someone had been arrested so quickly. However, everyone wanted to know who exactly was Donald Hume. Hume was an extremely colourful character with a checkered past. He had been born illegitimately in 1919 and first went to an orphanage after his mother gave him up. This experience was bleak and cold, particularly during the 1920s. He then went to live with his aunt, who, as it stated on the blog, another nickel in the machine, turned out to be his biological mother. This was not a better experience, however, as Hume later explained that his aunt treated him badly, and not the same as her other children. On the Crime and Investigation website it is stated that Hume said he grew up with a huge chip on his shoulder. Later examination of his personality would say that Hume had grown up with a distrust of those around him and of people in general. During his adolescence, Hume became involved with petty crimes such as theft and also became violent, getting involved in fights, sometimes with the police. During the war, he volunteered for the RAF Reserve Service, however he was discharged a year later after contracting meningitis. A medical report from the RAF allegedly stated that he had a degree of organically determined psychopathy. After this, he got involved with a number of dodgy dealings, such as impersonating an RAF officer and forging cheques. By 1949, he was married with a child, however he was still involved in several different rackets around London and did business deals in pubs and bars. It's reported in an article in Crime and Investigation that this is where Hume first met Stanley Setty. Setty was involved in the car markets in the area of Warren Street in central London. Here it was known that Setty was involved in deals of used cars and would often carry large amounts of notes with him. It was unclear what exactly the connection between the two men was, however the police believed that it was plausible that Hume was responsible for the murder. The inquest into Setty's murder took place at the beginning of November. While not much information could be shared as Hume's trial had not begun, Francis Camp shared his opinion about Stanley's cause of death. He stated that on the front of the chest were 5 stab wounds, 3 of which penetrated the lung and which were in my opinion the cause of death with the evidence available. He also stated that there were fractures to the ribs which were a crush injury and consistent with the body coming into contact with something. The detectives in the case also explained that they had made inquiries in both London and Essex and had subsequently arrested Hume. The inquest also heard the opinions of Stanley's family, who had been upset by a number of reports that had been published about Stanley. Mr. Victor Durand, a spokesman for the family, stated, "I wonder if you would give me the opportunity of saying that the deceased Stanley Setty has been an honest trader for well over 20 years. It may be if you look back into the past as certain papers have apparently done, digging deep, you may find something against this unfortunate man. But it is 1,000 pities that a man having lived perfectly honestly and respectably for well over 20 years, and is involved in this unfortunate death, should form the subject matter of large articles written purely for profit and of no benefit to the public. It has hurt the relatives very deeply." This statement was related to articles that discussed Stanley's deals and speculated about their validity. It was clear that the newspapers had become very interested in covering the case, and articles were written nationally about the upcoming trial. Hume appeared at multiple hearings throughout the next month, where the prosecution laid out their evidence against him. Mr. Maurice Crump, who was prosecuting, set out the timeline before and after the murder. He explained that Setty and Hume were known to each other and that Hume did a number of suspicious things beginning on the 4th of October, the day that Stanley disappeared. Hume had been overdrawn at the bank, however on the 5th of October he deposited £90 into his bank and made a purchase at Fortnum and Mason. It was found that he had used one of the £5 notes that had belonged to Setty and that were being tracked by police. The prosecution went on to say that Hume had been seen on the 5th and 6th loading large parcels into an aircraft which he had hired from Elstree. At around midday, Hume also took a carpet to the cleaners to be washed and also died. The green carpet was shown at the hearing, and it was clear that despite it being cleaned, there was a substance that looked like blood on it. He also hired a man to stain the floorboards under where the carpet had been. When this was examined by police during the house search, blood was found in the cracks in the floorboards and on the plaster. This was analysed and found to be blood group O, the same as Stanley's. Witnesses at the hearing confirmed the evidence found by the police. This included staff at the cleaners who explained that Hume had asked whether the cleaning could be hurried up. Mrs. Ethel Stride, who helped Hume's wife occasionally with the housework, said that she had also noticed that the carpet was missing. When she asked, Hume replied that it had been sent to the cleaners as there were marks and stains on it. He also said that he may as well do the floorboards while he was there. He asked her if he could use the kitchen for about an hour. Mrs. Stride said he wanted to put some things away in the cupboards. After about an hour, he came out and asked her to make him a cup of tea. Mrs. Stride then went on to say he left with some brown parcels under his arm that were almost square, but not quite. Another man also testified that Hume had asked him to sharpen a knife for him on October the 5th. This testimony appeared to show Hume's suspicious behaviour on the days following Stanley's disappearance. At Hume's 4th hearing at the end of November, more forensic evidence was discussed. This time bloodstains from Hume's house were analysed. It is reported in the Birmingham Gazette on the 26th of November that Dr. H. Smith Holden, director of the Metropolitan Police Laboratory, explained where blood had been found. Stains were found on the underside of the living room carpet, in the crevices of the floorboards, on the stairs up to the bathroom, and on the floor of the bathroom. Dried blood had also soaked into the plaster underneath. It is also reported that some blood had been found in a plane that had been examined at Elstree Aerodrome. In December, the magistrate, Mr. R. H. Blundell, decided to commit Hume for trial in January. He stated, "The evidence against you was completed on the last occasion, and it only remains therefore to commit you for trial at the Central Criminal Court at the session beginning January the 10th. It is reported that throughout all of the hearings, Hume had made copious amounts of notes and had listened very carefully to the testimony. The trial was set to start on the 18th of January 1950 at the Old Bailey. It was a much-awaited trial, with the newspapers documenting what happened each day. The trial took place in front of Mr. Justice Lewis and a jury of 10 men and 2 women. The judge ordered that the jury go and visit Hume's flat in order to get an understanding of the possible crime scene. He made it clear that nobody from the press should attend the flat along with the jury. When the trial opened, Mr. Humphreys, prosecuting, set out the timeline of the murder and stated that Hume and Setty were known to one another through the car market. He also set out the motive, as Hume was struggling for money and it was known that Stanley had a lot of cash on him. He stated that men had been killed for a lot less than £1,000. He also explained that while the case was entirely circumstantial, there was a lot of evidence to point to Hume. The prosecution explained that they believed the murder had happened at Hume's flat, and that he had cut the body up and put it into parcels, which he then transported out of his flat in brown paper. They pointed to Mrs. Stride's evidence that Hume had been in the kitchen alone for an hour, and then he had left with parcels. 20 of the witnesses were called on the first day, and the defence cross-examined Mrs. Stride. Mr. R.F. Levy, who was defending Hume, asked Mrs. Stride if she saw any signs that a man's body had been cut up, or any signs of blood. She replied no, and said that everything was quite tidy. On the first day of trial, we also gained more information about the statements that had been made by Hume when he was questioned by police. He reportedly said in his statement that he had met 3 men at the car market who asked him to transport some registration plates and some counterfeit petrol coupons by plane. He said the parcel was dropped off at his house on the 5th of October, and he dumped them out of the plane into the sea. He also said they gave him £150 in £5 notes. He then said that when he returned, the men were there again with another parcel, which he did believe contained a body. Mr. Humphreys poked holes in this statement to the jury, saying he had lied in it, but a murderer must lie. He must draw on a fantasy, and to use a word that Hume has used twice, he must romance in order to avoid the consequences of his act. On day 2, an unusual thing occurred. Justice Lewis became ill and had to be replaced with Justice Sellers. This meant that witnesses had to take the stand and repeat testimony, and that Donald Hume had to once again plead not guilty to the charge of murder. Dr. Smith Holden gave his evidence about the carpet, and this, along with several floorboards, were produced for the jury to examine. Other evidence was also produced for the prosecution, as had already been explained at the hearing, such as other witnesses and further forensic evidence. The defence, led by Mr. Levy, began to set out Hume's side of the story. He explained that his client was not pretending that he had never done anything wrong. It's reported in the Gloucestershire Echo that he stated, "Hume does not pretend to be an angel. He is no angel. But there is a long way between angel and murderer." It may well be that Hume is the sort of man who goes about claiming more than he is. He may be an exhibitionist, but it is not every liar who is a murderer, assuming he is a liar. Mr. Levy challenged the prosecution's theory of events, explaining that Hume was not as much in dire financial straits as they had made out, as the day before Stanley disappeared he had paid his doctor £30 in £5 notes. This, he stated, showed he had more than the prosecution wanted the jury to believe. He also attacked the credibility of some of the prosecution witnesses, including 2 men who testified that they had never heard of any men of the names Hume had described at the car market. He said, "Are these the sorts of persons on whose evidence you could hang a cat, let alone a man?" He went on to say that these men were involved in some serious conspiracy cases in the High Court. Mr. Levy also expressed that it was utterly impossible for one man to have cut up the body, parcelled it up, and cleaned the kitchen in the hour that Hume reportedly had that day. Continuing his opening statement, he also pointed to the lack of bloodstains on Hume's clothes and the lack of any fingerprints in Stanley's car. Hume testified that same day, and he stated that he had met these men whom he referred to as Mac, Green and Boy, who had asked him to fly the parcels out to sea. He denied knowing anything about the bloodstains on the carpet and simply said he cleaned them as they were filthy. His testimony ended with Mr. Levy asking Hume if he had murdered Stanley Setty, to which he replied, "No, most definitely not." The prosecution then further cross-examined Hume, particularly about the 3 men he claimed gave him the parcels to transport. The trial had come to an end after just over a week, and on the 26th of January the jury left to deliberate. After 2.5 hours, they intimated that they could not come to an agreement about the verdict. As they couldn't agree, a discussion with both the prosecution and defence was tabled. They decided that in the interests of justice they would not have a retrial. A new indictment of being an accessory after the fact was then put to Hume, and he pleaded guilty to this charge. This unusual set of events meant that Hume was found guilty of being an accessory as he disposed of the body, rather than being charged with murdering Stanley. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison for what was deemed to be his part in the crime. This was a very dramatic and unexpected end to the trial. Hume would end up spending just 8 years in prison due to good behaviour and was released in 1958. It wasn't long after his release that the newspapers began to once again report on Donald Hume. It was due to the fact that he had decided to sell his story to the Sunday Pictorial. This newspaper would later become the Sunday Mirror in 1963. The shocking part about this story was that Hume confessed to committing the murder alone. He admitted that he had murdered Stanley in his flat and had stabbed him while they were fighting. He also said the 3 men he had said had asked him to dispose of the parcels were made up, and that he had based the descriptions on the policeman that had interviewed him. It was clear that Hume was safe in the knowledge that due to double jeopardy he could not be retried for the same crime. It also meant that he could get paid for telling the real story. This astonished everyone that read it, however it was not the last time that anyone would hear about Donald Hume. Newspapers show that Hume was a suspect in several bank robberies, and that police were eager to speak to him after people gave a description which was similar to him. It was in January 1959 that Hume hit the headlines once again, and he was charged with murder a second time. He was arrested in Zurich, Switzerland, under the name John Stanislaw. The Coventry Evening Telegraph reported on the story on the 31st of January 1959. The article stated that he was charged with murdering a taxi driver and with attempted armed robbery. He had also been going under the name of Donald Brown. Swiss police stated, "We have absolutely confirmed his identity. There is not the least doubt that he is the man who is wanted by the British police." It's reported that he walked into a bank in Zurich with a gun, punched the doorkeeper in the stomach and wounded a cashier. He then tried to force the safe open, however didn't get any money. He then ran off as employees and citizens chased after him. In the bank robbery in Brentford in the UK that he was also wanted for, a bank manager was shot in the stomach. After his arrest, Swiss police interviewed him for a week. He then went on a hunger strike. He was to stand trial on 3 charges of murder, attempted murder and armed robbery. He once again faced a murder trial in September 1959, however this time in Switzerland. Hume's behaviour at the trial was erratic and bizarre, as he called the judge and lunged at a photographer. He was also seen grinning as he entered the courtroom. The most shocking parts of the trial were his comments about Stanley Setty. In reply to questions by the court president Hans Gutt, he admitted that he killed Stanley, saying he wasn't around anymore. He said he was willing to give details about the murder as long as he could not be charged for it. He told the court he had got into a fight with Stanley after he'd found him in bed with his wife. He also admitted that he had said in the past that it was because he had kicked his dog. He explained that they had fought all over the room at his home and that he had to get the carpet cleaned. He also explained that he stole money off Stanley, but that about 90% of it was covered in blood. This seemed to corroborate what the police already knew about the crime. When asked about the shooting in Brentford, he initially refused to answer any questions, telling the president to get lost. He then admitted he walked into the bank and held up the cashier using the gun. He then, quote, showed him he was serious and shot him. He stated, "I plead guilty. Is that sufficient for the jury?" At the trial, he also stated that he had taken photographs of a US military airbase in Maine and had shown these photos to the East German government. Throughout the trial, Hume continued to act strangely. smiling and humming as he admitted the violent crimes that he had committed. He was found guilty of the crimes and sentenced to life in prison. It's reported that he remained in prison in Switzerland until 1976, when he was then transferred to Broadmoor when he was deemed to be unstable. He was released in 1998, and it's reported in the newspapers that his body was later found in the grounds of a hotel. He had died of natural causes. Both trials were shocking, and the fact that Hume had admitted to murdering Stanley Setty seemed to put to rest the suspicion that many people had had that he had committed the crime. Hume's life afterwards also seemed to corroborate the idea that he was involved in Stanley's murder. The murder shocked everyone with its violent nature, and what happened to Stanley was so sad. It's difficult to say if there was any closure to this case, as Hume had to be once again arrested for any more information to come out about his murder. Sadly, other people had to die for the truth to come out and justice to be done. It's so important to remember Stanley's story and the stories of the other people that were caught up in these horrific crimes. Thank you for listening to today's episode, and I really look forward to hearing what you thought about it. If you would like to support the podcast, you can leave us a review wherever you listen, or you can just tell someone about it. If you want to contact me to tell me what you think of any episodes or to suggest any cases, you can on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. You can also email me at theunseenpod@gmail.com. Thank you as always to our Patreon supporters for everything that they do. I hope you will tune in next week for the next episode. And as always, I'm Caprice, and this has been Unseen.